Hello, everybody. Welcome to our beautiful episode where me and my best friend David we go over some of our favorite pieces of art.
On
Is
this
that right, David?
podcast. It's a
Yeah, on this
podcast.
podcast that we have right here.
Yeah. We're gonna be going over art and things that we like.
Whatever tickles our fancy,
Yeah,
as you may say.
that could be a good title. We don't know a title for the podcast yet, so it could be
Yeah,
the
we're still working.
fancy tickler podcast.
I wouldn't phrase it that way,
That would
but
be a good title for the
you
podcast.
could just leave it as the tickle your fancy
Fancy
podcast.
tickler podcast. Um, we had some other ideas, but they wouldn't work in like a new PC America, you know.
Exactly.
They were a little hardcore.
Counterculture.
Yeah,
Actually, we're the counterculture
we're the
with our podcast.
counterculture, but the regular culture needs to counter.
Yeah, but essentially what we're gonna do with this is we're just gonna go over the things that we like I said, tickled our fancy. And it's mainly just going to be whatever we're into at the time. And it's an excuse for both of us to kind of read or listen to or watch the same pieces of art and have a more structured understanding of it. It'll encourage a bit more analysis. And you guys get to come along for the ride.
Yeah, it's the intent is just to kind of have a record of our very amateur thoughts on the things we like. So like we will be able to facilitate a more intelligent conversation than our usual
Yeah.
banter.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so it is mostly just for us, at least right now. But maybe we can move past that. Who knows? Do you want to move on to what we're talking about today, or is there anything else that we want to really say?
I think that's a pretty good pitch for the podcast, and we can
Yeah.
get into today's topic.
Yeah, so
But
today's topic.
most of the show will be about an individual topic that we'll get into, like this.
Yeah, that's a very good thing.
Yeah.
Uh, Sometimes we might go into multiple things if they correlate, but for now, what we are doing today is The Stranger by Albert Camus. And this is a book I first read a while ago, and I got David to read for the podcast. But Albert Camus, he's a French philosopher. I think he didn't consider himself a philosopher, or at least he didn't consider people who were armchair philosophers as philosophers. But he wrote this book, I think, in 1942, and that's kind of during the. I don't remember if that's specifically during the Nazi occupation of France, but
It's
you
close
know,
to it. The way
yeah,
I read about it was that it was shortly before occupation was like very like it was there, and it was
yeah,
just this time of like total political like pessimism in France.
yeah, and so kind
I'm
of World
pretty
War
sure the
II.
publication was actually during Nazi occupation. Sorry.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for a lot of the philosophers of this time, especially French philosophers, there's like Jean-Paul Sartre, and there's another important one, but I don't really remember. My
Wait,
bad.
we're again amateur analysis
Yeah.
here. Very
Uh,
amateur.
but yeah, a lot of the French writing at this time was influenced by what was going on. And you can read into that for The Stranger. I'm not sure we will. That's more just kind of the historical context. But I guess what we can get into is what did you think about the book?
Well, before we get into that, I would like to get into my experience with it. I was introduced to the book probably a month ago by Ashton. The general structure of some of these episodes might be that one of us is trying to encourage the other to get into a thing that they might not have explored, and I am not uh, intelligent enough to seek out European philosophical novels by
I
myself.
think you just have your integrity still.
Yeah, I would like to not seem totally pretentious all the time. I'll seem pretentious all the time on the show, but in
Of
my
course.
human life in the meat space, I don't want to. But the book, the feelings I ended up having about the book, um, yeah, what I felt was like the book is just so inherently tragic for like a piece of philosophical material, which is really interesting because a lot of these philosophical things that I've read, and philosophical is just such a huge umbrella, but a lot of those things that are lauded as like being so seminal to a philosophy are very robotic, whereas this is just such a deeply personal book, and I both read and listened to it, and there were like conclusions that I came to at it while listening to it, like just how timeless that like complaining is. Because when you hear the main character Marceau like complain about things, which happens a lot, he'll complain about like the sun, or a feeling or a headache that he has, or being tired, and it sounds like, I don't know, someone in your life complaining to you. You know,
Yeah.
it's strangely like grounded in like personal book, and that comes from like it being in first person and all that. But yeah, those were my initial thoughts that I extracted from the book. If I were to like sum up what I felt about it in one sentence, it was that it was like astoundingly personal compared to what I expected about it,
Yeah. Well,
compared to what
another
I knew about
is
existentialism too.
yeah.
Yeah.
But did you like the book?
Oh, I loved it. Like it was one of the first times I've really enjoyed reading like a narrative novel in ages.
Yeah, and it's very strange because it's not necessarily that the book itself is boring, because I don't think that it is. The story is very interesting, um, but it is, like you're saying, kind of just a personal account of this guy's life.
Which is
The first,
what the other thing I came to about it was like the book, due to it being in first person from like this very like at least eccentric main character, you know, is that
yeah,
it's this story like about relatively mundane things for the most part, uh, at
yeah,
least
the
for the
guy
first
going
half of the book.
swimming on the beach
Yeah,
and
swimming, going to work, complaining about
funeral. Yeah,
funerals, yeah. All these mundane things, and it's being analyzed by Marceau in this bizarre and eccentric way that you wouldn't really like. You're able to analyze it as a non-participating party, but you see how what Marceau extracts from the events in his life as he experiences them, and it's a really interesting character study.
yeah, um, yeah. So I guess for me, I found the book. I don't actually remember when I found it. It was probably like a year ago. I feel like it was at the beginning of the whole Corona fiasco when I got into it. But I remember my impressions after I'd first read it. I remember really liking it, but I was kind of just confused because it seems strange. The book doesn't have too much of a purpose at the end, at least on my first read through. I don't know if you got that. You probably,
Well,
because you're a bit more analytically minded. I don't know if you got more out of it your first
what
read
I
through.
essentially got from it is because despite what happens in that last bit, it is the most optimistic that Marceau is the entire book. You know,
Oh yeah, no, it's an
Marceau essentially says that he's ready to live a full life despite it not mattering. You know,
yeah,
and that at the end, it's like whether he lives or dies, he has now like this. All of this has led up to giving him a chance at a life worth living, even in existentialism. Even if a life worth living is an arbitrary thing to say, but Merceau finally found meaning in like facing death and facing the emptiness that is death in his mind.
yeah. Kind of a recurring theme for Albert Camus' work. Well, it's not really a recurring theme. It's his whole philosophy. It's that of absurdism, and I guess we should explain that before we really dive too deep into the book. But absurdism is like existentialism in the way that life inherently has no meaning and the universe is totally indifferent to us as human beings, and that's kind of what existentialists believe. But Albert Camus, he thought that that wasn't enough. He thought what was important was kind of the rejection of that notion. Like, you have to accept the fact that the universe doesn't really care about you, but you should rebel against it. And he actually has a book called The Rebel. It's a philosophical treatise. It's pretty interesting. But he talks
Which we
about how
might get into on another
we
episode.
might. It's definitely a lot more dense, not a narrative.
Yeah.
Um, but he talks about how important it is to rebel against one's situation. Actually, I should have brought this up instead of the rebel. You're familiar with Sisyphus? Like, are you familiar with the myth of Sisyphus in
Yeah.
Greek mythology?
Yes.
Yeah, he wrote a book about the myth of Sisyphus, and it's probably the most concise exploration of absurdism that he goes into. And the thing is, Sisyphus, I believe he was the one that stole. No, that's Prometheus. My bad. Who's I don't remember what he did. Oh wait, no, he tricked the gods, and for his punishment, he had to forever, like for eternity, roll a boulder up a
Yeah.
hill. Once it
Okay.
got to the top of the hill, it fell to the bottom of the hill.
You need to pause there for a second, though, because not only did you, in doing that, make me doubt what I knew about Sisyphus, because like I know Boulder, that's what Sisyphus is to me, because I didn't read this book. I read the book we're talking about, but not the other book we're talking about. It's like you, and then you were going to ask me if it was right, and I panicked. Ashton, you can't do that because you can't give me a heart attack during the podcast.
Okay,
But
I guess I
continue.
won't do that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but the important thing was in that book is that Albert Camus asked the reader to imagine Sisyphus happy. Kind of the whole point of the myth is that it's supposed to be a punishment, him rolling a boulder up a hill for
For
eternity.
eternity.
But Camus, yeah, he compares it to our lives. It's this futile endeavor of us just trying and then usually failing. But it's kind of, he said that Sisyphus should rebel against his situation and try to enjoy it. Try to enjoy the process of getting the rock up the hill, even if he knows it's just going to fall back down. And I guess that's not the most concise definition I could have given of absurdism,
Well,
but
I think
it's a good precursor to us discussing The Stranger.
well probably the most easy to understand part of the absurdist nature of um the stranger is the lesson that's taught to Marcel during this about rebelling against the the futile nature of life that's been forced upon him. It's like the the entire narrative is grandiose and emotionally taxing in the latter half. You know,
Yeah,
he murders someone. Spoiler alert.
spoiler.
And he's tried for
Yeah,
murder. He's faced with death by guillotine,
yeah,
and
not a fun
he
thing.
finally realizes that he needs to live a life that's worth living to him, no matter how futile it is. But like that lesson could have been taught to a different person through the first few pages of the book. You know,
Yeah,
through seeing his mother die, through falling in love, through seeing the old man with his dog. It's like any one of these things could have all of these things were screaming the moral of the story at Marceau throughout the entire book, and he just couldn't latch onto it until it reached its absolute extreme where he's faced with his own death. And like the
yeah,
structure of the book is done in like a total like whereas usual narrative structure it's like the lowest point of excitement is the beginning, and
hmm
then it in the resolution it still remains at a higher point of action. It begins at a point of excitement at that's the same for Marceau at least as the end. You know,
yeah,
Marceau has accepted his life in a way that he accepted it at the beginning of the book. It's a full like arc that starts and ends at the same like I guess point on the y-axis.
yeah. And like structure wise, how it's actually written, there's two parts, and the first part ends at the climax, him shooting the Arab, and that's the only name we get for the guy. It's
Yeah,
the Arab. But the parts are split like perfectly down the middle. So the first part is like an hour to read, just about, and then the second part is also an hour. And so it really, I don't know, it's a nice package. Packages the ideas nicely.
yeah.
But like talking about the structure, we should just get into the beginning of the book. And first off, before we get into anything that actually happens in the beginning, I just want to talk about the first line of the book because it's so famous.
What is
Uh,
that line?
it's "Mother died today," or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that line is a really good preface to the book because it kind of makes you feel like this guy doesn't really care, even though he goes on to explain himself about how the reason he doesn't know is because the telegram was kind of vague. He, I don't know, it kind of just introduces him as this guy who that seems like something would have a lot of emotion behind it. This guy just found out that his mother died extremely recently. You'd think that the first things he would express to you is how much he cares about it. But it's just it's a thing that happens a lot in the book is Merceau, he just talks about the things that happen in his life so matter of factly. He rarely interjects any feelings
Well, yeah,
uh, to his experiences.
and he also the aspect of that he doesn't know when it happened. It's this recurring way that he deals with things that he doesn't understand by just not caring. Like he lives totally passively, especially when he doesn't understand things.
Uh huh. Yeah. So, oops, I dropped my phone.
Um,
What can we get into?
Another part about the beginning, this is what we could get into, is
Let's go.
there's the bit where Marceau is first talking to the coroner, I think, and when he's asked about like when the coroner brings up his mother, he immediately just says that it wasn't his fault. You know,
Oh yeah, that's an interesting thing because there's like three people who he says that, to, or at least who
well,
he
at least
wants to.
considers saying to,
Yeah.
because well, like I don't the I wondered while I was reading it if the line comes off as like if it translates better to French, you know?
Oh yeah.
Because the way I looked at it is like that is uh, my we should get into this probably at the beginning that I believe that Merceau is mentally ill in the
Uh
entire
huh.
book. And mental illness also arbitrary, especially when talking about something like this. But he is to me, he's obviously mentally ill, and lines like that come off as like just this bizarre, like nobody was asking if it was his fault. He's answering a question for himself, you know, and it's this idea that Marceau just repeatedly has this lack of social conventions and can't really handle it throughout the book and instead just lives passively because he's alienated by his lack of like social understanding.
Yeah, I definitely get there. There is a huge lack of social skills that Merceau has, and that's actually the point of the title of the book, is that it's the stranger. He's kind of a stranger to society.
Yeah.
But for me, I don't necessarily agree as much with the fact that he's mentally ill. And I'm this is not to like hurt your interpretation, but I'm pretty sure uh, Camus didn't write it that way. Like you can still interpret it that way.
Like
I have a
Camus
quote
can
by
suck
Camus.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, he can.
Yeah.
Obviously, art you can interpret it however you want.
Yeah. But yes, continue.
But he summarized the book with this quote. He says, "In our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death." And I think the commentary he's making here is that it's mainly just how do I phrase this?
Well,
Uh,
I should add that idea that I don't think that he's a sociopath, you know. I like a lot of people would jump to that conclusion that he doesn't really have an emotional attachment to things, but he obviously demonstrates some level of emotional attachment throughout the book. It's not. It's more that he buckles under a lack of understanding of it. He doesn't know why he feels the way he does, and he just lives passively because of it.
yeah, I guess I guess it's more because I relate to Merceau in that way. I don't care about a whole lot of things, and first, personally, I don't want to say that I'm mentally ill.
Well, I got news
Well,
for
that's
you,
right.
buddy.
No, but it feels like Camus is saying that Merceau is a normal person, or at least he could be considered a normal person, and it's tragic that he gets the end that he does.
Well, he doesn't get the end that he does. He might not. The way I read into this as like a full arc is like Merceau lives life totally passively, and whether or not he dies by execution, which is left ambiguously at the end, um, it's the best ending. He ends off somehow better than he did at the beginning, because he realizes a meaning in life that he wouldn't have been able to realize without these events. You know, and either Merceau dies and is released of the burden of life that the burden that he thinks of life as, or he's left to live another 20 years, 20 meaningless years, but he lives them with purpose that he didn't have in his younger life.
I guess that's where our interpretations differ, and neither of them are wrong. You assign a lot more value to the end of the book, compared to the rest of the book.
Yeah.
Uh, you think that he lives life meaninglessly in the beginning of the book, and he does, and that kind of at the end where he finds that meaning, you think that that's kind of a good. It's like an evolution for him.
Well, okay. So
But
this
for me,
is. Oh,
I don't know.
continue.
For me, it's one and the same. Like it doesn't. Like I think that he is just as happy as he was at the beginning of the book as he is at the end. Like he's just more accepted his death at the end. I feel like Camus is trying to say that you can just be happy living um, without much purpose. Because a lot of what he does in the book is just simple things, like he eats, or he goes swimming with a girl, or he watches a comedy, like, and he's content with his life. And and that's actually a thing that people get confused about him is that he's so content just being where he is, and he doesn't necessarily want to change. Like his employer asked him if he'd be interested in moving to Paris, and he's like, "Yeah, I could do that. I don't
And
really care."
they live in a colony in Algeria, and that's correct.
Yeah, I believe
Okay.
so. In Algiers,
Okay.
uh, I don't know where that Algiers is. Yeah, okay. Algiers is the capital and largest city of Algeria. So there we go,
I'm balling. Just saying, I'm a little balling. Uh,
dude.
yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, there's a really big thing that happens closer to the beginning of the book, so I'm okay with talking about it right now. That it really sort of it. I love it because it ties up my understanding of the book in a nice bow before the book actually happens, before the narrative actually happens, and it's the story about the old man and his dog, which at first when you're reading about it, you hear the old man. Does he call the dog a stinking bastard or something?
Yeah, and it doesn't really matter because it talks about how he just like curses at the dog and.
Yeah, but he like curses the same way at him every day. Every
Mhm.
time he curses the same way, hits the dog, and Merceau hears the dog whimper. And every
Yeah.
day, day in, day out, it happens. And eventually, the dog gets away from the old man, and the old man, through this through an obvious lack of understanding of why he misses the dog, communicates to Merceau that he does miss the dog. And the way he says that he misses the dog is because it would be hard to get used to getting a new one. And that's essentially Merceau's relationship with his own life. Like Merceau beats his own life. You know, he like when Marie, who's a girl that he obviously fancies, asks him if he loves her. He says no, even though he knows that saying that he loves her would make her happy, whether or not he thinks he loves her. It's this idea that he just abuses things that are extremely important to him, and he doesn't really realize why they're important to him. You know. And the
I,
way that the dog story ends is with the dog leaving, and the old man is lonely, and he says that's my favorite line in the entire book. Is when he's talking about the dog leaving, and he says that every time he hopes that the dogs outside don't bark because he always thinks that it's his. You
oh
know,
yeah, that's a cool.
yeah, it's the best line because it's this one line that like puts the feeling of Marceau when he's in custody into like such like perfect perspective for me because you feel Merceau he's looking for faces in the stone walls, and he's looking for Marie's face. Like everything he does, he always comes back to like this not because he's sort of eccentric, he doesn't care about Marie in a way that's very conventional, but he obviously does care about her, and he always comes back to it. No matter what, he always comes back to it as the one motivating factor. No matter how much he won't admit that he cares, he does. You know, that's the way I read into it
Huh.
personally.
I don't. I guess I'm not necessarily going to talk as much. I will talk about Satlama later, but I'm more interested in what you're saying about how he cares
Mm-hmm.
and like what he says. I feel like he says exactly what he thinks. Do you believe that, or are you
Well,
saying that he says things and he won't admit certain
I
things?
believe he doesn't love her. in any conventional way, but she is demonstrated to be the one thing that he legitimately cares about, whether it is of pure carnal desire or like that he does care about her as a human being. Because at multiple points in the narrative, he does bring up that he's a replaceable human being, but there is that it would be hard. It out of he the only way he can communicate it is out of convenience, because convenience is such a big thing for him as a character, but he never brings up replacing Marie with someone. He it's like the only question he sort of dodges, which is where
Well, the
uh
reason I think he doesn't do that is because of his philosophy of he doesn't necessarily care if his life changes. He talks a lot about how he doesn't necessarily think that Marie is more special than a lot of the other girls he's been with in his life. And during his time in jail, he talks about that, about how he used to think about, like in jail, he would think about all the girls he had in his life,
yeah,
and Marie was one of them. Like,
yes,
and so I feel like it's more out of convenience that he clings to Marie than out of anything necessarily profound.
which it might be, but by the end of the book, he talks. There's that line where he talks about the cleric. I can't remember the what's the church guy that he talks to. The
Let's just
cleric.
call him Claire. No,
Okay, the
remember all this
cleric.
quote.
It says that so many men have searched for the face of God in the stone walls that are like drenched with suffering, and
Mhm.
Marceau, in just a fit of the biggest fit of emotion he has in the entire book by like an exponential degree, says the only face that he searched for in the stone walls was Marie, and whether it is because that's the convenient way to present like the face of a woman, in some
Yeah,
interpretations, or if it is that he legitimately in some way does care about Marie, it's the only time he really demonstrates like he talks about a person in a non-disposable way. Like the book goes to a great extent to at the end when like Raymond is testifying, and he's testifying for like in favor of Marceau.
Marceau.
Marceau demonstrates that he really still only is pals with Raymond because it's convenient. It would make Raymond happy, and it would be harder for Marceau to not be his friend.
Yeah,
It would be more
actually,
taxing.
a quote from the beginning, right when because Ramon, just gonna call him Raymond because that's way easier for me.
Yeah, I listened to the audiobook, so I got like
Oh yeah, the
French
French pronunciation.
pronunciations. So
You
like
fancy.
I
Yeah,
lashed my head on something.
I think you might even be a fancy tickler.
I'm a fancy tickler, and I think it's my Italian blood that makes me
Oh, it
want to
might
say
be.
things in a fancy way, a fancy French way.
Doo-doo-doo. Oh yeah, but so Raymond just invites him in, and asks him to help him out, and then after he
Well,
helps him out, he's just like, "Oh, we're pals, right?" And
that's
he feels
another one.
totally different.
He enters Ramon's home because what is it? Raymond
He doesn't
offers
want to kill
him
Aaron.
blood sausages, and he thought it would be more convenient to not have to make food for himself. Like it's
Yeah,
literally demonstrated to be purest convenience. Like it's stated that he lives above like a store. He could just go walk downstairs and buy food for himself.
yeah.
But
It's
he
so
doesn't do it. That's the level of convenience that Raymond and Marcel's
relationship.
relationship is, and I think it's supposed to like in I think it's supposed to intentionally like juxtapose how Marcel feels about Raymond at the end of the book versus how he feels about Marie, and his feelings about Marie, like based on interpretation, you can't know what exactly is in his head because it's the first person account that he's giving you, but by the end of the book, like you finally see that Marceau finds happiness in caring about something, like whether it is like it could just be that like he wants to have sex again, and that's what he
yeah,
finds happiness in, is that the chance that someday he could live as a free man and watch an execution and have sex again. Those are like really the two desires that you could concretely say that he wants, but you could also interpret it in the fact that he wants to sort of find solace in that domestic life that his parents had, not perfectly domestic as his father was absent, but like he sort of talks about like close to right before the climax, he talks about how he thinks of himself as a married man for the first time and is sort of happy about it. You know,
Yeah.
like it's a thought that he's willing to entertain that isn't like oppressing. Because every thought that Marceau has, you could essentially make like a chart of what thoughts are oppressive to him and what thoughts are happy to him.
Mm-hmm. Uh, I think we should probably move on to the climax,
Yeah.
just because for time wise. But I do want to go back to also his name is Salamano or Salamano.
Solomon. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Sal
There was
Volcano.
two quotes that I found interesting, and they're pretty close to each other. But the whole purpose of the quote, well, not necessarily purpose, but if I summarize them, he talks to Merceau talks to Celeste and Raymond about Salamano and how he treats the dog. And they're both Celeste and Raymond are like, "Oh, it's a horrible thing that he does this." And both times Merceau says that one really can't be sure if Salamano shouldn't do what he's doing, or if he. And when Raymond asked him if he was disgusted by what the old man did, he simply just says no. There's this huge indifference that he has to uh,
Well, it's
what's
because
happening.
he's got to see both sides of it. He's got to see both sides of the conflict. Maybe he had a good reason to kick the shit out of the dog.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I feel like what's important to him is that it doesn't really matter, and that's kind of a big theme in the book because it's absurdism. But
Well,
nothing that happens really matters, and there's a lot of lines that he says where it's just like, and through every point of the book, it's just like no matter
well,
what you do, you get the same conclusion.
well. That's another thing about the book that I don't necessarily agree with you on because the book is legitimately suspenseful for me. Like by the end of the book, even though, well, it's actually interesting because Ashton had read the book previous to me, and you had described the plot of the book to me in a different way from how I interpreted it, and
Uh,
it ends up like it ended up because I was going off what I believed from your interpretation of it, and it was I think you generally lean towards the side that Merceau dies at the end, you know,
yes,
for
yeah,
all intents and purposes.
hmm
But in my head, like the ambiguity of it is so much more optimistic. I think generally the book is supposed to be a critique of existentialism more than like the seminal work of existentialism that people sometimes play it up to be. And it's like, uh, yeah,
I think
I
it
don't really
functions
know where I
both
was going with
ways,
that
really.
last bit, but yeah.
Well, I think that your interpretation is good, like for the book.
Oh yeah,
But I think
and
that
yours
both
is
of it,
too.
the like, I think it's a bit too narrow-minded to say that it is a critique of existentialism because although Camus wasn't an existentialist, he did have many existentialist ideas as
Oh,
a part of his philosophy.
absolutely, and I'm sure that they're in things like the Rebel, with how you've described it to me. It is a more seminal work of existentialism rather, but this book seems more integrally to be like a critique of it, not in disdain of existentialism or in a way that says existentialism is wrong, but it's more critical than what would be like thought of a seminal work of a philosophy, you know.
Yeah,
And
I think it was very interesting, kind of how we are different people. We interpret this very differently.
yeah,
I
that's
think it's the
I
way
mean,
it
it's
would.
kind of why we're making the podcast.
Yeah, it is. I get that.
Sorry.
But I mean, specifically for this book,
Yeah.
I lost my train of thought, sadly.
The same. I had something to say about the critique of existentialism it was working with, uh, but I just totally lost it.
Yeah, maybe we can come back.
Which is well, that's what you should expect from the show. So
Yeah,
get used
not a
to
whole
it.
lot of professionalism, folks.
Yeah.
But I think we should move on to the climax right now.
Climax. Yes.
And the climax is when Merceau shoots the Arab.
Yes.
I don't feel like the point of this podcast should be to summarize everything that happens in the book.
Yeah, you should
Like,
have probably read this
if
before
you want
listening.
to know what like what we're talking
Listen to
about.
the Thug Notes video before watching this.
That will make everything way better. We
Yeah.
aren't as good as the Thug Notes guys.
Yeah, Thug
Or
Notes guy's pretty cute. So,
yeah, he's
yeah.
awesome. No, but the most interesting thing to me about the climax is the sun, right?
The sun. Yes, I know he
The
keeps
sun,
talking about the sky splits open.
yeah, and how like it's pounding in his head and he can't think clearly and he's tired and he's dizzy, and how there's many points where he's on the beach alone and he's going back towards the stream. And he talks about how he just wants to be at the stream because he thinks it might be cooler. And how he talks, you know that he doesn't realize that the Arab is still going to be there.
Yeah,
Like, he doesn't go there with the intent to kill.
in no way does he intend to kill him, and that's another piece of it. Piece of why I think that he's mentally ill. You know, is how easily overwhelmed and how it presents him being overwhelmed by just the world around him.
Uh huh.
You know, because in like if the intent was to be, and I know it's not provable. You know, if anything, it's provable that I'm wrong. But like, in my opinion, if the intent was to present Marceau in that sequence as like not mentally ill, but just sort of indifferent, it would have been he's scared that scared of like the pain that a knife could bring him. You know, not that he's gonna die because that would reject the point of the novel right there.
Yeah.
Like because obviously instantaneous death doesn't really scare my or so it's the surprises and waiting and needing to think about it scares me so.
Changes.
Uh,
Yeah.
but like the idea that it's just this overload of the heat and the sky and you feel just muggy and gross when you
Yeah. No,
read it.
it's amazing the
Yeah.
writing. It makes you feel like exactly how he feels, especially if you've ever experienced like an Arizona summer.
Yeah, especially if you've driven to work with no air conditioning in Arizona,
Yeah.
it's
As a few of us have.
it's rough. But like, yeah, it's really it's scary, and that's where you get into that like that dichotomy of the way that Marceau's brain works. It's there's pleasant and unpleasant thoughts and experiences for him. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is strange because you'd think that he's a totally indifferent character, but he does essentially group things into pleasant and unpleasant
Well,
throughout the
what
book.
you're saying there, we need to analyze the sun to get into what you're beginning to talk about. So
Before we
first,
do that,
well,
though,
I want to give a bit more background to the scene. What did you want to do?
I just wanted to get back to the pleasant and unpleasant thoughts thing because I
Well,
brought it
that
up
is
earlier. Well, just one like note because
okay.
I brought it
Yeah,
up earlier, and
yeah,
it's
okay.
back on like what my argument that he does care about Marie, and it's because at that conclusion you do see Marie sort of become an unpleasant thought because of the fear of losing her. You know,
Yeah, I guess.
he that becomes unpleasant for him, and Marisol's general MO for the entire book is that an unpleasant thought he doesn't entertain anymore. And that like demonstrates like at least some it's a very small change, but the idea that he entertains the unpleasant thought of losing Marie demonstrates some level of caring that he didn't have in the beginning.
Yeah,
But continue with what you were going to say about the sun.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna give it. Although we aren't thug notes, I am gonna give just a slight bit more background, and then we can talk about the sun. But the sun is the most important part of this scene, in my opinion. But Merceau, he gets to the creek by the rock where he sees the Arab, and he thinks that he should head back. Like literally, he knows that he should, but then he says that the sun is what presses him onward, and he takes another step. And then obviously, the sun glints off the guy's knife, and it blinds him, and then like the sweat falls into his
And
eyes,
it's
and it's just a chain
blanketing his
reaction.
eyes and blurring him. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then eventually, like, there's I don't remember specifically what it is, but there's like some wave of heat that hits him, and then his nerves tense up, and he fires the gun. But what another interesting thing is, and we can talk about this after the sun, or maybe we can find a way to incorporate it. But he shoots first, and then he stops, and then he shoots four more times, and it makes no sense why he would shoot four more
No,
times.
it absolutely 100% does. 100%. Because integrally, the one, like, the the one caveat that keeps Marceau from being a total existentialist at the beginning of the book is that he cares about what people think of him. And in that immediate moment, the idea that he would be faced with the immediate consequences of someone being mad that he hurt them, it scares him enough to finish the deed. You know, in the way I interpreted it, at least when I read it the first and second time, is that the idea of shooting him once was an accident for all intents and purposes, and it's like he shoots him once on accident, and it might not have killed him, but when he's on the ground, he doesn't want to be faced with the judgment of the Arab knowing that he hurt him or made an attempt on his life, and he finishes the job there.
Yeah, I definitely strongly disagree with that interpretation.
Well,
I think that the
then
first shot was on purpose, and that the 4 shots that follow were the accident.
okay.
But I guess this is a good segue into talking about the son, because Merceau states right then and at the trial that the reason he shot the Arab man the first time and the next 4 times was the sun. So, what
Mhm.
do you think the sun represents? What do you think the sun is?
Well, I think it represents like oppressive thought to Marceau. It represents the like general oppression of life, in like the oppression that he experiences in a life that he doesn't care about, and it's that balance that he runs in his life where it's the pleasant thoughts and ideas and experiences versus the unpleasant ones, and if the unpleasant thoughts end up outweighing the pleasant ones, he has no reason to live. You know?
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting interpretation, and I think that specifically is where our interpretations of the album, not album,
Album is a
the book,
book.
split, like is in our interpretation of the sun, because the sun is kind of one of the most important things in the book. I
Yes,
keep wanting to say,
that we could agree on.
yeah,
Absolutely.
but for me, the sun represents the indifference of the universe, like kind of going along with existentialism,
Okay.
because the sun, there's the things that stick out to you in your mind when you read this book is how uncomfortable the sun is to him most of the time,
Yeah.
like at his mom's funeral when he has to walk and he's just sweaty, or right here, or in the courthouse when it's hot out. Uh, but
The
there's
the
a lot.
mom's funeral bit with the son is very interesting. We didn't get into it though because it's one of the only times we see Marceau empathize with someone. Like truly empathize in a way that isn't based on convenience. He realizes that like it sets the precursor for him empathizing with his mother at the very end of the book and understanding why she'd like adopt a fiance.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
With how he just thinks about this like, and this goes a lot with your idea of that it's just this like, it's essentially what like I would describe as an act of God, but to someone who doesn't believe in God, it's just the indifference of the universe. You know, it's like it's just this. What is it? For just a second, Marceau realizes that his mother was like just as oppressed by the universe as he was. You know.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh, oh yeah. I should finish the sun thought.
I need to stop interrupting your son thought. Yeah.
You're fine. No, but so the sun largely, and on my first read through the book, I didn't understand it as much because I could only focus on how uncomfortable the sun was. But he also talks about the sun for the nice parts. Like he talks about whenever he goes out with Marie, how nice the sun is, and like because the sun is out, it's such a pleasant day, and how the first time when he's on the beach with like Masson and Marie, he goes and lays down in the sand and he talks about how pleasant the sun is, like on his back.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because if the sun was supposed to be this horrible thing, it shouldn't be able to bring him any joy. But I think that's the important part is that the sun can do either things, like either of the things. It can either bring pleasantness to humans or it can bring
Oppressive heat.
discomfort. Yeah,
Yeah.
oppressive heat. And because of that, it's totally indifferent to what happens in the universe. And it is the sun is kind of a very important part of what we consider the universe. And so I think it's a good symbol for that.
That is an aspect of the symbolism that I didn't really consider as much. Like that the sun is like all is both like it is the neutral, it is the worthwhile and not worthwhile parts of life. Well, I mean, not
Yeah,
worthwhile isn't the word. The pleasant and
well, yeah,
unpleasant parts of life.
yeah,
Um,
and I didn't. I didn't recognize that on my first read through, and that was something that came to me more this time.
But yeah, my idea of him, the general theme throughout the book is that uh Marceau is inherently very afraid of being judged until the end. That's another development he goes through. It's another like sort of arc he has, and
Yeah,
like,
that's another one that I just didn't see like until the very end, and maybe if I read it again, I could
well,
see it.
like you see the part with the like most obvious part in the opening is when all the like elderly people come in to mourn his mother,
Yeah.
and they're wearing like nice clothes, and he says for a split second he thought they had come to judge him. Like he
Oh.
understands
Mhm.
what his reaction to his mother's death isn't societally appropriate.
Yeah.
It's like nowadays it is. You can have that reaction to a death, and people understand and want to understand. Like people want to be more understanding of something like
Yeah.
that. But
But Frank thought he was a bit more developed in social customs, and
yeah,
there were specific things that you had to do.
yeah, it was France 70 years from now. 70 years ago. 70. How can I not count 80 years ago? Yeah, it was a different time, and that idea that like Albert Camus says that a man could be put to death for not crying at his mother's funeral. It's that idea is symbolic because it's like some people are just not suited for the world they live in. You know.
Yeah, for their society.
And it's even though like if had what is it, Marceau be completely detached from society, he would be totally existentialist, and he wouldn't be afraid that people would come to judge his reaction to his mother's death. He still has enough conviction in his own emotions and his own feelings that he doesn't double back on them, which is what we see in the trial. But we do see Marceau uh, generally fear judgment in the first part, and then he begins to fear it less in the second part.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I just never noticed that. Like my brain never picked up on the parts where he was getting judged. The only parts that I did pick up where he was feeling judged was the parts where, because for most of the book I thought that he didn't care about other people, and I still do. Like our interpretations are just different of this book.
Yeah,
Um, but you get that in the trial where the prosecutor just like has so much conviction about how Merceau is guilty and evil, and he talks about how although it's foolish, at that moment he wanted to cry. Like, and it
yeah,
was like that was the first time he had felt that in forever, like the judgment. Like that's the first time it felt real to him and that it got to him. And then there was another part where the prosecution said something and then silence fell through the courtroom, and that was the first time that he felt like a guilty man.
yes,
And
yeah,
it was and to me it's only at the end that he was able to feel what society felt towards him. That was
yeah.
my interpretation.
Well, like my other like it's my the way I thought of it generally in that part is that it sounds really grim. That essentially my interpretation is that Marceau is forced to bend to the will of society. You know, the only
Well, I mean
way
that
that
is kind of
he
what it's saying.
the only way in that book is that the end of that book is that although he can't accept things like God into his life, he does accept it, like hope for salvation at the end. He's Marceau's story is that of like a very conventional anti-hero in structure. You know, have you ever like you know what an anti-hero story is, right?
Yeah.
There's two paths an anti-hero can take. It's salvation or destruction, and their own actions will lead them towards either one. But the integral part is that they can be redeemed. But the part that makes uh, interpreting Marceau as an anti-hero so um, I guess unique is that in your mind you don't feel like Marceau is doing anything wrong. Marceau is
Yeah.
not like the most. Marceau is the most sympathetic anti-hero that exists because the book very intentionally glosses over things that could make you morally contested with him. Things like,
Yeah, like if they had described the Arab a bit more, or even gave
yeah,
him a name.
if they gave him a name, if they gave him a family, you'd feel like Merceau deserves punishment. By the end of the book, you don't feel like Merceau deserves any punishment at all. And at the end, Merceau looks towards salvation finally. But the ideas of salvation and destruction in the book for Merceau, especially, are totally arbitrary. You know, salvation and
Yeah,
destruction mean probably the same to him, at least at the very beginning. They do, and the end is that he sort of he does what humans do, and he bends towards someone's will for the sake of survival, and he accepts something weirdly enough, the cleric sort of convinces him to accept some idea of salvation, and like, be it only momentary, if his
but
appeal
there's a
just gets
very important
rejected.
distinction in the types of salvation,
Oh,
um,
yeah,
because the cleric wants him. A normal person in his situation would think about his future well-being, that what would happen after death, um, if he is consigned to death. But what he like finds as his salvation is in the present, and that's a big like theme in the book is living in the present. That is all Merceau is able to
Merceau
do.
does. He can't think of any. There are glimpses into him having foresight, but they're very small and few and far
Yeah,
between.
and you can see that in the fact that he like keeps trying to. Oh, it's the chaplain. He keeps
Chaplain,
avoid
okay.
like he keeps avoiding trying to see the chaplain, and instead he spends his time thinking, like obsessing about whether he can escape his death. Like before he comes to terms with it, he pushes away future salvation in order to better be able to obtain present salvation. That's what's
Yeah,
really important to him.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
I feel like we should
another
talk
thing
about.
about these. Oh, what were you gonna say?
Well, I feel like we should talk about the chaplain now. But is there something specifically that you wanted to say?
Well, just with that, it's like we're pretty much just going over the end of the book here by now,
Yeah.
and it's the talk about escape. Your interpretation of it, actually, I didn't really look into it that way, and I do agree with a lot of it. And it's
Uh-huh.
another huge part of it, though, is that he wishes to be gunned down in the street.
Oh
It,
yeah,
it,
that's a cool line.
which is it shows it's one of those minuscule glimpses into an idea of foresight, because he thinks that if he escapes, he'll end up in just as dire and sad of a situation as he's in now. um, Whereas the one of the more ideal things to happen would be to just be gunned down and not have to live with the fear of a surprise execution, or entertain the thought of losing Marie or his life. I know you don't agree with that part of it. To me, that's what I read into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's it's very, that ending part. It's just he, like, to me, I do think that his acceptance of salvation is very similar to religious salvation now, because like, whether,
Yeah, that's one of our differences. I think that Camus specifically like rejecting religion
well,
in that
I think it's
in,
specifically rejecting religion in any form of significance, But whereas Merceau condemns the chaplain for wishing for a second life in the same way that Merceau would wish for a new car or riches or whatever.
uh-huh.
It's a wish.
Actually, I want to talk about that quote
Uh,
later or
okay.
right now if you want, because
Well,
I love it.
it is cool, but way that he, the way that the book ends is that he essentially accepts hope that he might be able to live a life with meaning, a fresh life, and that fresh life could be in the moments before his execution, or it could be in a life where his appeal is made and he's able to live in prison and then go free or whatever. It's he
But at that
accepts a
point, it's not a wish.
wish. Well, what? Hang
But
on.
at that point, it's not a wish.
Uh,
Uh,
when you would consider it, yeah, I did kind of botch it there. It's like, when you consider it that he can be just as happy living before execution, yeah. But if you consider his like hope to live that life where he watches executions and has sex again, things that he
oh yeah,
does
yeah.
want. It's like
Definitely.
those. That's just the like he's giving himself a wish in the same way that he looks at. Like I think the way it is a like condemnation, not condemnation. Yeah, whatever. It condemns religion, but it's in a way that it's like this way that it admits that everybody needs to put that significance somewhere, you know? And
And
that's
Albert Camus
goes with
advocates that significance should be in the present.
yeah. And it's like that's the absurdist way of looking at it that like it could be placed anywhere. Like you could play he could have placed an equal amount of significance in the idea that his appeal would go through and he could live a happy life or solely in the present that he could live happily up until his execution or in the idea that he could escape and somehow be happy
Yeah.
being gunned down or living a long and fulfilling life. It's that it's no matter what, it's a wish, you know.
Uh huh.
Whether it's an obtainable wish like living happily before your execution, or an unobtainable wish like theoretically getting a second life where you remember everything, like he says, uh, it's all a wish.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
that's another cool line.
you
Um,
talk about your lines now. Yeah,
yeah. So the first time I read this, I only like quoted 5 quotes. Like I only cited 5 quotes, like for me to remember. And one of them was that one that you brought up, and I'm just gonna read it. But the chaplain says to him, "No, no, I refuse to believe it. I'm sure you've often wished there was an afterlife." And he says, "Of course I had." I told him, "Everybody has that wish at times, but that had no more importance than wishing to be rich, or to swim very fast, or to have a better shaped mouth. It was in the same order of things." And I like that quote when I read it, just because that's exactly how I feel, and that's a lot. That's a big reason why I read this philosophical stuff. It's just to confirm my own
yeah,
beliefs with cool quotes that I find. It's kind of gay,
yeah.
actually.
So
I
you
shouldn't
can
say that.
sound like a badass when
No, not that. But I like
you're telling
seeing my
someone on
ideas
Reddit that
put
God
so
doesn't exist.
concisely. Um,
Yeah.
like if people thinking about things that I also thought about and saying it way better than I ever could have.
Which is
But
this is a very fitting first episode because that is what we want to do with this show is sort of communicate our thoughts and
yeah, definitely.
force our thoughts onto things that other people have made.
Uh huh. But
Yes.
for this quote, if you ever lost someone to like close to you, you would know that you might wish for an afterlife where you'd get to see them again. Because in this life, if you just take the very basic existentialist view, there's no way that you will ever see that person again or be able to interact with them again.
It's totally
And that was
impossible.
something that bothered me for a while, especially since I have lost someone pretty close to me in my life. But it's just after a certain point, it just got to that level where I realized no matter how much I wish for there to be an afterlife, like that doesn't make it any more likely to be true, any more likely to happen. And
Yeah.
that's why I like how he said it. Like it's just a wish, and it shouldn't like it shouldn't
You
influence.
shouldn't bank your life on it.
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, I thought that was a cool quote. If you have
Which
something to say about that, then you can. But
well
there's another.
like my interpretation like as I do I would say that I probably believe in God and an afterlife
Uh-huh.
just and it is sort of the my understanding of it is like actually the sort of flip coin of the way Marceau doesn't believe in it. Marceau doesn't believe in it because he doesn't want to waste time on God, you know? He
Yeah.
doesn't he believes it to be more convenient to spend time on things that interest him. Whereas it's pretty much the exact opposite for me. The idea of a God interests me. I don't I don't think I'd ever feel the need to force the idea of a God onto someone or convince them to believe
Yeah,
in
it's a
God.
totally personal thing.
It's just a totally personal. I think that it helps me cope with day to day life. You know, there's
Yeah.
no real reason for it other than that. Um, and it makes Marceau relatable, even though I don't agree with him. But it's his like my interpretation. Like if I were to make an argument on the Bible being good, you know, in the scope of the world, you
It's the
know,
Bible.
is like it's like the Bible is responsible. It's a work of art that's responsible for terrible things like crusades and
Yeah, lots of bad
terrible
stuff.
philosophy, just horrible death and terrible things. But the idea that anything can give so much hope to so many people makes it worth it to me. You know, it's
Yeah.
like it doesn't justify the Crusades, but it makes me not condemn the Bible.
Well, it's
And it's
kind of like the sun in that regard because
yeah,
it has inspired so many horrible things, but it's also done a lot of good.
well, it's partly that, but it's partly just the way that you're raised. Like the sun is a factually like the sun is factually good. Someone who was impacted poorly by the Bible would not think of the Bible the same way I do. And it's because I was raised to read the Bible. And granted, I don't read the Bible much anymore, and I'm not as religious as I once was. Uh, but on the flip side of me being raised to place value in the Bible, uh, Rousseau is raised not to really place value in the Bible and not really to place value in anything, so he needs to find hope somewhere else. And he
It's totally
does.
okay. Okay, so
Yeah. What?
yeah. Sorry, there was a bit of a technical thing on my end.
Oh, okay. We're back.
Yeah.
No, we're not going to cut anything there. That was good enough. I was ranting while you were having difficulties. But yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I kind of want to talk about one more quote. I think it's a nice bow tie on the end of this, and so we can go into this. And then, would you be fine with closing everything up?
Yeah, I think that would be good. I think this is a
Okay.
good
Yeah.
interpretation. I think we've voiced our individual interpretations of this well.
Yeah. But I like this quote. It's at the end, and again, it's another one of those. It's an idea that I had, but I never was able to put it so clearly. But one thing that Merceau says is every man alive was privileged. There was only one class of men, the privileged class. And most people would probably disagree with that, like just on how it's stated alone. But like
Yeah.
in context, Merceau is saying the gift of being alive is so great that every man is able to appreciate it, or at least should be able to appreciate it. And obviously not everyone does, but for me I like this quote so much is it's just because I find that for myself. Like I will literally be doing nothing and then I'll just be like randomly I'll just be so happy just because of the fact that I'm alive. Even if I'm not doing anything specifically to make me happy.
Yeah.
Like being alive is enough to make it worth being alive. I
Yeah.
don't know. You ever get that?
Uh, I of course I do, but it comes to like just fundamental difference between us as people, and it's more often than not I do place stake in hoping for a better time, and I don't live as in the present as I would like to. It's like
Uh-huh.
that's an ideal I would like to exhibit more than I actually do.
Yeah. And that is largely where our different interpretations come from of this book. Like my interpretation of the book, I think is closer to what Camus intended, which is not necessarily a bad thing for your
Oh,
interpretation. It's
absolutely not.
just,
Yeah.
it's just, I already thought a lot of these things, and Camus, and like I relate to Meursault a lot. Like you said that you relate to Meursault, but I probably like
Oh,
there's a lot.
you definitely you kin him.
Yeah,
Ashton
I
actually
can.
runs the Stranger Kin blog on Tumblr.
Yeah, yeah, follow me.
Yeah.
But
At
no, but
Merceau
like
Thoughts.
our interpretations are different uh, in kind of because we want to justify how we already live our lives, and we find that meaning in the book. But yeah, I like the book.
It is a very I do believe it as a very intentionally blank site because like
It's pretty vague for a lot of it, which
yeah
is a good.
well like I'm willing to say this is a book that you chose, and I believe you chose it because of how it reflects the way you think, and it's
Yes,
fun
that's why I like it so
talk.
much.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about things that are reflect the way that you think, and I
Uh-huh.
deeply enjoyed it, and I deeply enjoyed making this episode. But like, there's come a time when something impact that articulates the way I think happens. I feel like we'll come to a reverse ending of this
Uh-huh.
episode. You know, it's
Yeah,
like
you'll find a work
yeah.
that specifically correlates with you.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm
it's
learning.
gonna be the Pokemon movie or oh no, it's the
Yeah.
Care Bears movie. That's mine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, look out for that episode, guys.
look out for
The
Care
Care
Bears
Bears
movie, the
movie
episode. But
of our funny podcast.
of our funny podcast that we don't have a name for yet, our fanciful ticklies podcast.
I think that's a good note to end everything on. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I enjoyed talking
Yeah,
about it with you.
and if you somehow listen to this without having read it, you should probably read it. Because you could
Yeah,
have
maybe
read like half of it in the time you just listened to us talk about it.
that's good. It's a
It's
short
a
read.
pretty
That's the only
short
way I
book,
got
yeah.
you to read it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
thanks for listening.
See y'all.
Bye.